Okay, well, without further ado, thank you everyone for making time. Wait. Okay, well, thank you everyone for making time and joining us today at the Jerusalem Fund for a book talk with Ramsey Hanhan on his new book titled Fugitive Dreams. My name is Mohammed Abu Ghazala, and I'm the Program and Communications Manager here at the Jerusalem Fund. Before I get started, just a couple of things for everyone to know. One, please silence your cell phones if you haven't already, so we don't have any interruptions during the talk. Two, please sign in if you haven't already up front. And third, to let you all know, we are live streaming on our YouTube and our Facebook page. Now, without further ado, our moderator for today will be Saeed Adaqat, who is a member of our Palestine Center Committee and is a renowned journalist as well. And just to let you all know, please stick around after the discussion for a chance to have your, to have your copies signed with the author Ramsey Hanhan. Now, Ramsey Hanhan, having come to America from Palestine in his teens, had experienced firsthand both the Israeli occupation of his country and the immigrant journey of rebuilding life anew. Prior, he was a physics professor noted for his computer models that describe and predict complexity in nature. Nowadays, you can find him on a jogging trail, deep in the forest, at an airport, or in a coffee shop. For his next titles, he is finishing a romantic novella and a collection of essays. Hanhan holds a Ph.D. in engineering from the University of Michigan. Without further ado, please welcome Hanhan to the Jerusalem Fund.
Thank you. Okay. Go ahead first. Thank you, Muhammad, for this nice introduction, and thanks to Saeed and the Rukia and the rest of the Palestine Center staff for making this possible. And thank you all for coming. This place feels like home. When I used to be an activist in around 2003, 2004, used to have a lot of events and activities here. I'm going to start by reading a page from the book. I'm going to go to chapter 13. And that would be a good introduction for what I will say. Chapter 14, body counts. Click, click. It was my first time using a typewriter. Miraculously, the anachronistic dust-coated specimen in the copy room still worked. I needed it for my application for US immigration, required to be typed on carbon paper, no less. Apparently, they had missed the memo about the turn of the millennium. Click, click. Character by character, I painstakingly filled the form on behalf of Charlene and myself. With Palestine in turmoil, I had made up my mind to stay in the USA. I dreamed of becoming a US citizen one day. Despite a misguided foreign policy and a xenophobia that sometimes extended to immigrants, I found much to admire about America, particularly its ideals, heterogeneity, and inclusiveness. I liked my American friends. I appreciated the individual freedom absent from much of the rest of the world. I respected the clean environment and the Americans who cared about it. I wanted to stay. One sore spot nagged me. Of the US taxes I faithfully paid every year, part was diverted to fund the Israeli military, typically averaging $3 billion a year. This military aid was bolstering the occupation. My own earnings were being misdirected to a foreign country, paying for munitions to threaten my loved ones and to destroy my country of origin. It was obscene. For the average American, the federal budget is a political issue to be decided by elected representatives. For Palestinian Americans, aid to Israel is personal. And so I'll begin here. I was born in Jerusalem 50 years ago. Came to America when I was 16. in the middle of the First Intifada. Studied engineering, then I worked in physics some 25 years, and stayed here and became a citizen, traveling to Palestine every couple of years. I had my parents until recently. I still have a brother there. And on every trip, I started taking notes on the situation because Palestine was changing very, very fast. My urge to express myself finally overcame my love for science, and I changed careers and began this book, Fugitive Dreams, Chronicles of Occupation and Resistance. Fugitive Dreams is the story of Palestine at the ground level, from the point of view of someone born there, as I say in the book, on the wrong side. Samir, the narrator, is from my generation. He was born just after the start of the occupation in 67. So you might wonder, why another book on Palestine? What's special about it? And I do things differently. There's a lot of information out there about international law, UN resolutions, who started this, who did what, too many compendia of historical grievances. And I wrote Fugitive Dreams to highlight, through personal stories, other matters that aren't discussed in the news at all. Themes like the humanity of Palestinians. How are their lives affected by conflict? What is it like to live inside a wall? How do people cope with oppression? Themes like children. How does it feel to grow up in a conflict zone? And what kind of dreams will those children have? Trees, the environment, open space, clean air, the landscape, water, all those things are threatened, under assault. And I meant to show how the conflict tramples the very land that it's supposedly fighting about. As you might guess, there's much about immigration because the narrator Samir, like many Palestinians, becomes an immigrant. So I address questions like, what is it like to be transplanted? How do you find a place in a society that, especially after September 11, identifies you with its enemy? How do you reconcile yourself as an American with the foreign aid that's going to Israel? And then there's the other issue that I recently gave a talk about that at Sabil meeting. You can view a recording from my website. It's about Christianity. Samir is a Palestinian Christian, which puts him in a particularly difficult position. His whole life, he's struggling to reconcile his Christian heritage with the way the occupiers of his country and their supporters here use it to disenfranchise and dispossess him. His beloved Bible is reduced to a doctrine of supremacy and promised lands. And he's struggling his whole life to reclaim it. So I showed the connectedness of the Palestinian Christian community and Palestinian culture in general to the land of Palestine and to that biblical past. Fugitive Dreams is in 3 parts. I'm going to run briefly through what each one of them is about. Part 1 follows Samir's childhood growing up in Palestine in the 1970s and 80s. His is a child's voice. He's innocent, hopeful, idealistic, perhaps naive, observing without judgment. And through his eyes, the reader gradually learns about the conflict, the way a child born in Palestine would. His is a lost generation. He's in his teens during the First Intifada, but that formative experience of his generation was soon eclipsed by Oslo and its failures. So By 1990, under various pressures, the schools were closed down for years. His physical safety was threatened. His family was under economic strain. His family decides to send him to America. And that's where part two begins. Part two looks at the 90s and the early 2000s from point of view of Samir in America. His is the grown-up voice of someone who knows how the world works, becomes cynical, angry, sore, maybe not bitter, but his innocence is definitely gone. He has engaged in activism for years, and there's no results. The wall is just growing longer and longer. As you might imagine, this part is as much about America as it is about Palestine. As I mentioned in the beginning, for Palestinian Americans, aid to Israel is personal. So Samir is searching. He wants to identify the source of US support for Israel. He visits, for example, a Native American reservation, contemplates concepts like the frontier and manifest destiny, contemplates American militarism and its linkage to aid to Israel. He even revisits the writings of British and American travelers from the 1800s to Palestine to try to understand the attitudes of why do people in this country so strongly support Israel, at least officially. In all of this, his child voice hasn't died. It recurs in dreams and flashing moments of peace, at Ramallah sunrise, perhaps, or in a taxi, passing by the silhouette of a little girl holding balloons, spray painted on the wall. Part three begins in 2010 when he becomes a father. On a trip to Palestine with his 5-year-old, her innocent question takes him by surprise. Tell me more about the Israelis. She whispers against a surreal landscape where totalitarian control is automated and mechanized and towers in concrete. Her child voice rekindles his own dormant dreams. He understands that for her sake, he must do something. Part three, and the whole book really demonstrate what I consider the raison d'etre of Palestinian resistance: love. Watching news from Palestine, Israeli brutality, the murders, some on camera, the land theft, the destruction of homes and schools, and the suffocating wall, it is easy to get outraged. But outrage in itself does nothing. The Palestinian struggle for freedom is not motivated by vengeance, hatred, bloodthirst, or anti-Semitism, despite whatever Israeli propaganda wants us to believe. No, the Palestinian struggle has never been, and there is no room for any of those in the movement. However, when injustice reigns, resistance is love. Every prophet and every saint in both testaments of the Bible, in Talmudic lore and in the Quran, stood up to injustice. Jesus himself was a revolutionary who upset the religious authorities of his day. So was Muhammad and Moses before them. It's easy to mind your own business, turn a blind eye, but not they. They resisted out of love, as occurred in John 3:16, for God so loved the world. And when you look at Palestine today, you see the child with a slingshot fighting tanks and drones. It's David and Goliath again. You become an activist for Palestine because you love, you care, you want a better world for your children and for others. You love justice and you love peace. That's why you get involved. And so in Fugitive Dreams, you clearly see Samir's love for his daughter, for Ramallah and for his community, for Palestine and its land, and for the earth. Earlier I called Samir's and mine the lost generation. Born right after the start of the occupation, many among us spent their entire lives under occupation, technically stateless, no other citizenship. And yet, at least, we are old enough to have encountered Israelis as individual human beings outside of army uniform. With the wall in place, our children and grandchildren, whole other generations, know Israelis only as soldiers or settlers. Likewise, young Israelis know Palestinians only through their compulsory military service. And think about it, every Israeli's first job out of school is an armed jailer. And then, is it any surprise that Israeli society today is more extreme by any measure, voting for people like Ben Gvir and Netanyahu? So the urgency of a book like this is to ask the question, how many more children are we going to let repeat Samir's story? See, how much time do we have? I'm gonna read you a paragraph from chapter 2 from early in the book, and this will introduce two of my favorite characters. By late afternoon, this is talking about Ramallah in like around 1980 or something like that. By late afternoon, the shepherd showed up, leading his flock of sheep and goats over the hills to feast on the greenery, slowing down traffic as they idyllically crossed the street, to the music of bells tied around their necks. The one lame sheep always trailed behind. The shepherd sometimes led his flock to the fig tree in the lot next to us, eliciting a stream of loud curses from the elderly woman across the street, whom we called Old Granny. She was an otherwise kindly old woman who sat in her traditional embroidered dress all day long on her balcony watching the street, greeting everyone who greeted her. Though I hardly ever saw her picking the figs, woe unto anyone who touched that tree. And Old Granny and the tree end up being the last two characters to speak in the book. They get the last word. And that fig tree, I end up personifying it throughout the book as its life unfolds alongside Samir's. When he's a little kid, it's outside his window. He looks at it while his grandma reads him the Bible, and it reminds him of the parable of the fig tree. And then as he grows up, he plays in its vacant lot. It was witness to his childhood games, his wanderings about the hills. Its vacant lot was its favorite hangout. That was a place where he daydreamed. He wanted to be a pilot, and he dreamed of adding wings to his bicycle and converting that lot of the fig tree to a runway. Of course, the irony is that in Palestine, at that time, there was no country, there was nothing you could be. You can't be a pilot, you can't be anything you want. You only have very few, very limited opportunities. And still. So later we see with Ramallah's rapid growth, vacant lots are squeezed, and that fig tree so far survives. They even build a huge building behind it, and the construction trucks use its lot to carry stuff, and the tree survives that, survives the fire the following year. And at the very end of the book, it speaks, answering the spirit of Old Granny, both of them becoming symbols for the land and the ancient wisdom that built the Sanasil, becoming symbols of endurance in Arabic, what we call sumud. So I say that again in a different way. Love is resistance. Injustice, war, bloodshed are nothing new. The earth has witnessed 2 world wars, colonialism, slavery, plagues, and crusades, and that's in the last 1,000 years alone. The reason we're here what keeps the world going is love. Like many Palestinians, my own parents, lost everything they had and were barred from going to all the places they knew when in 1948 they were evicted from Ramleh and Jaffa. Had they succumbed to defeat, I wouldn't be here today. Love is what made them rebuild and start a family and propel me to where I am. Love is why Palestinians are still here. Love is humanity's last hope. And I'm going to conclude with a poem from towards the end of the book. It's called Memories of Palestine. I'm just trying to find it. There we go. Memories of Palestine. The smell of fresh bread, rosy stone catching the sun on the Jericho road. The peal of church bells, star flowers wild on the hills, flocks of sheep crossing the street, bells tingling, gunshots bursting the silence of a quiet afternoon. The adhan carried across the wind. Reading on the balcony in morning sunshine, facing west on the veranda, inhaling the salty sea breeze. Haifa in the morning, clambering up and down the cable car. The glimmer of the rising sun, skirting the ridge on the way to Nablus. The dawn, little fluffy clouds blushing pink in the sun. The shadow of the peak slowly unrolling. Jaffa, Akka, Beit Shemesh, Gaza, Bir Saber. I never saw Al Khalil. Hide and seek in the vineyards of Latrun. Jerusalem in Easter, no Easter without it. Where else celebrates Sabt Nur? Ants building tunnels and complexes underneath a stone. Lizards scurrying into the shadow. The bray of the donkey announcing the milkman. The old city walls, its domes, the streets. Beggars outside the church on Sundays. The nuns telling us what not to do. The ice cream boy walking the streets while I comfortably idled my summers. He toiled in hot afternoon sun. How many kids carried that loaded fridge, only to be robbed by the neighborhood bullies? I saw one beaten by the soldiers. Why do bullies always pick on the ice cream boy? All he does is make children happy. Climbing the trees, waiting in spring for fruits to emerge. The green almond, the green plum, then cherry, the apple, grape, fig, and mulberry, the cactus pear, the guava and jujube, ushering fall. What a bounty, all under the concrete or barred by walls. Hardly an open field, a hill or a tree, the sea breeze blocked, the rosy rocks of Jericho, out of the way, the churches of Jerusalem beyond the gate, and for sheep, nowhere to graze. The balcony is covered with dust, the veranda with bullet holes. Jaffa, Haifa, Akka, not even in a dream. The village road all built up, the sun peeking every now and then between the high rises. Is the water still running? Latest shortage lasted only 3 weeks. The road to Jerusalem, so familiar, now so surreal. Checkpoints and detours, sneaking like a burglar breaking into his birthplace. Child of the land in a den of thieves. Thank you.
Thank you. This one? Is this on? Okay, great. Well, thank you, Ramsey. That's certainly a very, very tender presentation, I would say, and definitely it's very graphic and the imagery and so on. And you make us feel it every step of the way, and I think you're the embodiment of what the Palestinians are. I mean, I remember, I think it may have been the late Edward Said or one of our late great friends who said that Palestinians, their full-time job is being a Palestinian. And he said, you could be an engineer, you could be a doctor, you could be anything, a banker, whatever, but that's your part-time life, Your full-time job is that you are a Palestinian, I mean, I did a similar journey, not as profound as you would, with such an amazing book and so on. But in my former life, I was an engineer and I was a designer and so on. And then I found myself doing what I'm doing, So we can relate on this level a great deal. I want to ask you something. Now, your family comes from Haifa. My wife's family comes from Haifa. I am from Abadis, which is a village next to Jerusalem. Have you been to Haifa? Did you get a chance, during the time in which you lived in Palestine, occupied Palestine at that? Did you get a chance to visit Haifa?
My family is actually from Jaffa and
Jaffa. I'm sorry, I take it back. Yeah. Did you get a chance to visit Jaffa or Palestine, 1948?
Let me put it this way. When I was a kid, we used to go to Jaffa maybe every week on Sundays, go to the beach in our own car, my dad driving. And that changed with the peace process when Oslo started. Immediately, concurrent with the peace process, Israelis put checkpoints everywhere to prevent us from going to Jerusalem, from going to Jaffa. Suddenly we needed permits to go, which were very hard to get. And so my whole adult life, I was subject to those permits. I couldn't go to Jerusalem whenever I want. Even Jerusalem, which was like 10 minutes away from us. So the further away the city is, the less I see it. I was doing a count just the other day. Jerusalem, I still managed sometimes to go smuggled to Jerusalem. I couldn't do that to go to Jaffa because if I get stopped anywhere and asked for ID and I don't have that permit, I would be arrested. So Jerusalem is easy. It's just this one city. I could duck into some alley. I know the city inside out. So Jaffa, maybe since 1990, I've been there 5 to 10 times. Haifa, 3 to 5 times. Akka, maybe like 4 times my whole life. Because it's so far away that even if I get that permit, I need to spend 2 hours at the checkpoint. Permit starts, it will be like, 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. So even if I leave 6 a.m., spend 2 hours at the checkpoint and drive 3 hours to go to Akka, then I need to be back at the checkpoint before 10. The day is gone. I only have, an hour in Akka. So, and I couldn't drive my own car anymore. I would have to take a taxi, pay the taxi for the whole day, which not too many people could afford. And so they made it very, very difficult for Palestinians to travel anywhere, even within the West Bank. And my understanding is that the whole point of all those difficulties is to force us to leave, to make life so miserable that people just want to get out.
Can we agree that?
Oh, sorry.
Let me just continue a little bit and then we'll turn. I just want to finish my conversation with him, then I'll turn to you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay, no problem.
I'm sorry.
No, please, no, because we want to engage at that level. No, but just to follow up on Jaffa, Haifa, and Akka, did you engage with the Arab communities, Arab Israeli communities, that the so-called Arab Israelis in Jaffa, where there are, vibrant and robust Palestinian community, and in Akka, the same thing, and to a lesser extent in Haifa? Can you share some of those sentiments or your encounters?
Yeah, I talk here about one person who actually I knew him because he was married to someone from Ramallah that I knew. And he ended up becoming what Israel did after 1948 is take Jaffa and combine it with Tel Aviv, make one municipality.
Right.
And that way, the Arabs that are in Jaffa, which are a majority still, even after
Still.
the Nakba,
Mhm.
would not be a majority in their own city anymore.
Right.
It's the same thing they did to East Jerusalem, combining it with
Right.
West Jerusalem.
Right.
And so finally, it took them years and years and years of organizing to get the Arab community to elect 2 members in the city council for Tel Aviv, Jaffa.
Right.
2 members out of, dozen or more. And so I quote something from one of those 2 members about how difficult it is for that community. Again, they need permits for anything like construction or opening a store or anything like that. Those are almost impossible to get if you're an Arab, if you're Palestinian in Israel.
Very interesting. And you talk about the character or the person Samir in this book.
Yeah.
A great deal. So where's Samir now?
Good question. He's sitting here in front of you.
Huh?
So basically, the book is very much autobiographical. I changed names.
Okay.
I fictionalized it a little bit, changed some minor details, but tried to stick as much as possible to historically verified
Right.
material. But basically what, I don't want to spoil the ending for you, but he decides he has to do something drastic in order to secure a better future for his daughter.
Mhm.
And there's a lot in the end about peace and healing and forgiveness and growth. I'll quote one line from the very last chapter. I'll quote 2 lines actually. One is, he calls it, "I dream of a Jerusalem with no borders, a Palestine without walls." And that's the vision. And then talks about how the peace process failed because it was supposed to be temporary. But that temporary status was never really supposed to end. And that process is supposed to continue. The emphasis was more on the process than the peace. And he says growth is the only process that ought to never end.
Well, you said so many things. You talked about the Palestinians' ability to endure. You call it sumud, endurance, and I think you translated it into sumud. And I think with every passing day, the Palestinians become closer to freedom because the ability to really be rid of them become just harder with every passing day. I cannot imagine anything short of a horrendous genocide or, maybe wholesale eviction, or ethnic cleansing, really changing the trajectory of the dynamics of the Palestinians, where they are headed. So I'm certain, it's the road is definitely rough and painful, and full of not only challenges, but things that, you need rudimentary things so you can survive on a daily basis. But I think in the end, it's, at least to me, intellectually, I can see it. And I think that you as a writer can see it. But also you've experienced this on the ground. Share with us, if you will. Share with us elements of Palestinian ability to endure, their endurance as children, as adults, as old people.
Oh, that's basically the whole book. That I mean, one thing I talk about here that I didn't actually realize it growing up. I was in the middle of it. It took me to get, 40 years later, grab a pen and start writing to realize, oh my God, have this moment. So I talk about the Intifada, the First Intifada. And during that time, it was a challenge to get an education. We had to have secret classes because Israel closed the schools and they threatened to demolish any building that's used for educational purposes, unauthorized educational purposes. And so we would meet secretly in different places. Eventually, we organized secret classes at a place that's supposed to be not a school, but a technical institute where they taught typing and stuff like that. And we would bring our own teachers and we would go into that classroom. It was right across from the post office where the soldiers were stationed. So we would walk one by one right in front of their noses. And I write about that. But at other times, it was very dangerous just to have our safety threatened. So I'm going to read you one paragraph from that. The French school itself was surrounded by a high wall and a barbed wire fence. Yeah, in Ramallah. So this is like during one of the short intermissions where schools were actually open. The barbed wire fence hampered us from leaving to participate in protests and somehow kept the soldiers outside. Nevertheless, the adjacent Israeli police station peeked right into our classroom. Every once in a while, some kid threw a stone over the fence and shooting followed, ringing right into our classrooms. At such time, we hurried out of the room, crowding the stairwell while we waited for the shooting spree to end. Eventually, all the glass windows on the police side of our building had been shattered. We were lucky that the walls of the school building were built of thick stone in the old style. Years later, though I was horrified at every school shooting in America, it did not occur to me that I had repeatedly experienced school shootings. It was normal that they shot at us, school or no school. Yeah.
No, we'll get there. I don't want to talk too much because obviously we have people who want to speak. But I want to, something that you wrote in the book. I mean, the moment that you felt that you want to leave Palestine, you want, in a way or another, you want different kind of life. But at the same time, our identity, our identity as human beings is all about Palestinianness and so on. So how did you, I went through it as well. So I just want to hear from you. How did you reconcile these sentiments?
Yeah. I talk about that a lot in chapter 9. I was conflicted first on the plane because the day before, suddenly my whole life is going to be changed. And I didn't know I was getting a visa to come to America until like the day before the flight. So I had very little time to prepare mentally. And, thinking about the classmates and friends that are leaving behind in Palestine and they're going through an intifada and they're struggling for freedom. And now I'm in a different place. And then I see the American kids and they have a completely different life. They don't have the sense of mission that growing up in Palestine we had. So all that stuff is discussed, but I would describe like almost the entire college years as being ambivalent, or sometimes like doing Arabic things with my Arabic friends, and sometimes going into with American friends and being wandering between two identities, in and out. Eventually, I had to make my own identity as a person, regardless of labels.
Okay, thank you. Turn to you. Here comes the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Because we also are having this.
My question is not my question. My observation is that Palestinians are Semites. This is the latest form of anti-Semitism. And it's totally unrecognized.
Sorry about that. Yeah, that's,
You mean the being anti-Palestinian, or calling the Palestinian movement anti-Semitic? Is anti-Semitic?
No. Israeli belief towards Palestine and Palestinian is the latest form of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And I really think it deserves to be recognized. Arabic's a Semitic language. You are a Semitic people.
I would agree with that. The thing about Zionism is that it's an ideology. And it's an ideology based on some form of supremacy that says this group of people is more qualified to be in this particular place than any other people, even including the ones that were there to begin with. And that's a twist on the age-old formula of colonialism,
Colonial.
which says that those people, because they have a more advanced society, they have the right to go and colonize those countries and spread progress to them. Except with Zionism, they added the dimension that, look, we have this book that we're going to use as a deed for the land. And but the whole attitudes that I experienced from Israelis in there is one where they think they're supreme to us, where, you know, just because they're speaking Hebrew and wearing that uniform, they could yell at us and stop us and ask us where to go and impose their rules on our society. Even in the West Bank, which you know, they're supposed to be occupying, and there's certain international rules that govern occupation. They do whatever they want. If they decide to cut the road to connect settlements, or if they want to build a new settlement, they don't ask us for our opinion. They just decide what they want to do. They come to us and say, here's an order, get out of this land, we're going to build their own. And, you know, that's obviously, you know, depends at its core on a concept of supremacy, which, you know, anti-Semitism is one form of that.
If I can just follow one more point that is always concerned me, and that is that, you know, I've been to the Ramallah meeting in the past several years ago. Palestinians get a very bad treatment in the Bible, in the Christian. The Philistines.
Sure.
And I mean, that's hard to overcome, I think. in you know, the view of, from the view of people who aren't familiar with what Palestine has been about for a very, very long time. And it's, I can't get over the feeling, the thought that modern day anti-Semitism is Israel's treatment of the Palestinian as fellow Semitic people.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I was always bothered about the Philistines, and I think the identification of the Philistines with the Palestinians has nothing to do with fact. It's just, it's done purposely by the Zionist movement. The Christian Zionism, when, like, if you read writings, for example, from travelers to Palestine from like the mid-1850s, mid-1800s, they don't equate the Palestinians with the Philistines. That came later. That came with the Zionist movement. So people like Mark Twain, for example, he wrote The Innocents Abroad. And he did not, you know, he in some places he talks, you know, there's Orientalist attitudes in there, talking about natives in even Greece and Italy. But he does not make those same religious comparisons. And if you look at us culturally, what Palestinian Christians and Muslims, a lot of their customs in villages are very similar to the ones of the Israelites in the Bible. So in a way, you know, Palestinians could be very well descended from the Israelites and from the early Jews and early Christians. And that's more likely than, you know, being purely descended from the Philistines.
You know, I just want to make a quick comment on this, because you mentioned something also that's very important in the presentation. You said that Samir went on quest of knowing what the roots of support, you know, this sometimes messianic support of Israel. What is what's the root of it? And in fact, it is messianic at its root. I mean, if we go back 5, 6 centuries and so on, go back to England, go back to King Charles, for instance, and there are actually references to, you know, fulfillment of biblical things and so on about reclaiming. And then, you know, this movement, which really was galvanized, you know, and honed by Christian Zionists, and it's racist at its heart, took very strong presence and roots in the 19th century. If you look at, you know, Balfour and his father and so on, if you look at Churchill and his father, if you look at the connection with the Rothschild and all these things, you will find that these people, and Churchill, in fact, himself, he said it, when he was asked about Palestine, he said he had no qualms about having a civilized people coming and uproot people and, you know, have the place to themselves because they could civilize it. He said this about Native American. He said this about African. So these guys were racist supremacists. They were colonialists. And that is really the root of the Israeli state. You know, the world associates anti-Semitism with anti-Jewishness, and that probably is true. I mean, you know, we look at Europe, you know, the Jews were targeted. The Jews were targeted to, you know, to advance, you know, supremacist theories, to advance pure theories, and so on. So, you know, without delving into this, I mean, anti-Semitism in its modern form is meant really to target the Jews, and without, you know, delving into all these biblical splitting hairs and so on. The issue that we have today is a colonial issue. You know, it's a racist project It's a project that exists as the very non-existent of the Palestinians. They're very non-existent. I think if you go back and you take certain slogans, like Golda Meir, when she said there's no such thing as the Palestinian, or a land without people for people without land. I don't think these guys were idiots. They knew exactly that there are people, there are vibrant communities, and so on. But the thing is, how are you going to justify taking the land unless you say that it's empty of people, or it's empty of people that claim it rightfully? So it is a colonial project, and there's also a great deal of sympathy. I mean, look, we lived in this country. I lived the better part of my life in this country. It's a great country. I've been to every state, I did all kinds of things. But let's face it, this country is a settler colonialist country. Australia is a settler colonialist country. Canada is a settler colonialist country. New Zealand is a settler colonialist country. I mean, look at today. I mean, this is, however you look, whether it's in Iraq or Ukraine, whatever, you find that England right there is just doing America's bidding and so on. So it has really, it gave birth to these movements and so on. So we focus on the colonial aspect of the struggle. And that's why you have erected walls. That's why you have laws. That's why you have checkpoints, because you want to keep these people repressed and oppressed. I often ask, I'm a journalist and I go to the State Department and I pose the question time and time again. What are the Palestinians allowed to do? You don't want them to fight with sticks and stones. You don't want them to fight with sticks and stones. You don't want them to have actually marches, as we have seen in 2018 and 2019 in Gaza, during the return march, where they were actually sniped from across, from behind the fence.
Saeed, let's stay focused on the book, please.
Yeah. So we'll get back to the book, but because the issue of the anti-Semitic issue and so on. So these are the kind of things that are actually reflected. I mean, it's the journey of the Palestinians for freedom.
Yeah, I mean, I ignore using labels. So I don't use the word anti-Semitism, I think.
Right.
Maybe I do use it at the end, referring to the anti-Semitism in Europe as being a major source of trauma for Israelis,
right,
that they haven't healed. What's really relevant here is, to me as a Palestinian, is the Nakba. The Nakba is this event where Israel expelled almost 1 million Palestinians out of their homes, created a refugee problem, and that's what Israel was founded on. And one thing that bothers me is that to this day, almost 75 years after the Nakba, there's no memorial for any of the villages that was destroyed.
Wiped out.
They deny it, the Nakba. And so what I say is whatever healing Israel was supposed to get from anti-Semitism, it was supposed to be a solution to anti-Semitism in Europe. Jews could leave, emigrate, get Israeli citizenship, become empowered, and heal from all that trauma. And all that healing was thwarted because of their denial of the Nakba. If they cannot own up to the Nakba, they'll never heal from their own trauma that the Germans and the other Europeans caused. The Nakba left a deep void in the Israeli psyche. With that vacuous foundation, Israel is forever trapped in the mantle of vigilantly defending the alternate reality its founders have manufactured. Suppressing truth has become a compulsion. They campaign against books for fear that people will read them. They establish nonprofits to embalm their falsified version of history. They infiltrate activist groups because they abhor the power ordinary people possess to challenge lies. And that chapter 16 in particular, I wrote it about the movements here in America that try to silence activists who work for Palestine.
Let me ask you about the Nakba. Do you feel, I mean, we have seen in the last year, films like Tantura, for instance, you know,
Yeah.
or the other film like Farha, whatever. Do you think that actually does it make any headway within Israeli society? Does it open their eyes? You believe does it open? You know, because you also said something very profound. You said that every Israeli's first job is that of a soldier, where he
Yeah.
actually represses. He's out there to repress Palestinians. So, do you think that films like Tantura, films like Farah, I think, can actually begin to open Israel's eyes? Because that's going to be a watershed moment if it happens.
I hope so. I mean, when I wrote this book, I hoping that Israelis would read it. I connected with one Israeli guy on LinkedIn who asked me some information about the book and then decided he doesn't want to buy it because I'm an adversary of the state of Israel. That's his words.
You are what?
Adversary of
Oh,
the
an
state of
adversary, yeah.
Israel. But I really hope that Israelis could pick up a copy and read it or watch one of those movies about the Nakba. One of the problems that is more global now is we live in a compartmentalized world where people just watch whatever news they want to hear and
Right.
they shield themselves from things that are uncomfortable.
That's true.
I have another question.
Please, go ahead.
Has the Arab world ever produced a film regarding the Nakba?
The latest one is Farha from, I think that's Jordanian. Yeah,
Yeah.
on Netflix.
That's
I haven't heard of it.
I haven't watched it personally. It's for me, the Nakba is very difficult because even though I didn't experience it, it's kind of in my DNA. Like for me, I feel it's too soon to even like watch something like that animated. But maybe, you know, I'm just bracing for the moment to watch it.
but
I heard very good reviews.
it's a great question. I mean, you know, I think, you know, with all the rich history of film, let's say, Arab film and so on, there are you know, I'm sure there are films that about history, about the wars and so on. But the actual documentation, you know, whether fiction or non-fiction of the Nakba, it's very, very scarce. At least it's scarce if it's in. So it's a good point. It's a good point. Please, go ahead.
Thank you for writing the book. I mean, it hit home with me. Oh, thank you. So I visited Palestine for the first time in 15 years about 6 months ago. I stayed there 2 weeks before the olive harvest. And just recently, my mother sent over some olive oil from the olive harvest. And yesterday, my brother Iyad, you know, brought back some olives with him.
Very nice.
Yeah. And the one thing when reading your book, it's so descriptive of the land and the fig tree. We have some fig trees in front of the house. You even talk about the dust that the leaves collect from all the construction. And I saw this and you know, so I appreciate the fact that it was so descriptive that I could see it, I could visualize it because I lived it. And you so effectively share that with people who haven't visited Palestine, that if they read it and they go, they're going to see it. Every bit of it, they're going to see it. It's a truly, I look at it as an encyclopedia of living in Palestine, not just at that time, but the way it looks, the way it is, the feel, the environment. So I appreciate that. My question is, how, you know, because you mentioned how Israelis, you question how Israelis must feel also about the occupation and their indoctrination. Because a lot of people feel that the Zionist project is, it's really good at marketing, that they're in the right, on the right side of history to the rest of the world, but they're also keeping their Israelis in the dark as well, because they keep the truth away. I believe they keep the truth away from their own people. So I come across many Israelis on social media and we talk about things and they say, oh, no, there's no way we could have done this. There's no way, because they don't want to believe that about themselves. My question is, how can we reach through your book and accounts like your book more Israeli supporters? It's Israelis of Israeli supporters. How can we reach them to take a look of accounts like this?
Thank you, Nader, for your kind words first. And the one thing that Saeed mentioned about the military service, I note here that military service in particular is a form of indoctrination.
Yes.
They put them in a uniform. Now that kid has authority over us. As a result, we are dehumanized in the face of those kids who could decide whether we could go to the checkpoint. They're carrying a gun. They tell you to stand and raise your hand. You have to stand and raise your hand. So first they dehumanize us. Then they take them to different places around the country, show them the borders, tell them that we're always trying to come in and do terrorist acts, and show them Masada and tell them about Jewish history, and show them places where it's very small and Israel's existence is threatened. Look, there's our enemies. And they come out from that mentality when they're 18-year-olds. So the only hope of reaching Israelis would be to go to children, and I don't know how to do that. And they're even inventing Israeli superheroes to get to the children before anybody else does.
One more point. That book also, is it going to be translated into other languages?
I hope so. If you know any publishers or any translators that would be interested in taking,
you should be like,
at least Arabic. And
I mean, I feel like it also could, because you talked about forgiveness.
right.
And that's something that really generally is not talked about at all, especially in Palestine. There aren't too many people talking about, okay, well, we have to come to a point of forgiveness. And I appreciate, that thought. But I think that in order for that discussion to be had, also probably have to be translated for people in Palestine to read. And
in
other
Hebrew
places.
for people
And in
in Israel.
Hebrew, yeah, because it's definitely something that I don't think is very, or at least not talked about.
I mean, here's what happened before I got to that conclusion. I lived 35 years in the US, away from that turmoil. I had 35 years to heal and get some of that trauma out and reprocess it. The people who are living there, they're getting new trauma every day.
Yeah.
And it's impossible to even begin healing when it's like that. So something has to be done to stop, give people a normal life first. Remove that trauma away, and then the healing will begin.
Well, in addition to that, I think, we could use the South Africa example. You have to have the Truth Commission, which means people come out and say, look, we have done some horrible stuff. This is what we've done. That's the only way really in reality you can.
There's nothing to forgive if you
I have,
don't admit to anything.
yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
you
have,
don't recognize it.
I've been around, and I tell you what, we watch these demonstrations in Israel, day in and day out. It had 10,000, 20,000, 30,000. I yet to see one sign that calls for the end of the occupation. I have not seen it. Maybe some of you have. What I'm saying is that the collective consciousness is either premeditatedly oblivious what goes on in the Palestinian. Now, although the first job of every Israeli is to serve, to oppress and to enforce that occupation. When they go back, it's like, you turn the page on this. Until that happens, it's going to be very difficult because, you're the victim, the victim, as Ramsey said, I mean, there's new trauma every day. There's new trauma every day, every single day, and we see it, we report on it, and so on, we move. But it's not something that Israelis are really talk about. I mean, when you see these demonstrations, massive, right? I mean, it's not like the anti-war movement in America when it was against Vietnam. Well, with that,
I was thinking just today, I saw some comment somewhere that, this is the end of democracy in Israel if that Supreme Court is dismantled. I'm like, as a Palestinian, I don't care. What has the Supreme Court done for us? Have they stopped administrative detention where Israelis could take any Palestinian and put him in jail with no accusation for a year or more?
charge, yes.
And they've been doing it for 30 years. What has the Supreme Court done about that? Has it stopped the wall? Has it declared the occupation illegal? Has it helped stop Palestinian land from being taken away for the wall or for settlements? No. So as far as I'm concerned, the Supreme Court of Israel could go to hell. Doesn't make a difference to me.
Thank you, Ramsey. With those,
There's no democracy to begin with.
on this note, we end our event today. We thank you very much.
Thank you.
We appreciate your book. It's an eye opener, and we certainly hope to see it widespread and in many languages. Thank you.
Before we go, can you tell the people online where they can find the book?
Oh, you could find it on any bookstore online can order it. Amazon, Barnes and Noble have done, Walmart even. If you have a favorite bookstore, I think Middle East Books in DC might also carry it.
Excellent.
Any bookstore could order it for you too.
Well, thank you.
And I have some copies here too.
I definitely want you to
have
sign a copy for me. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I'm glad you put me back when I